As the current publication of the rule set is now the digital Crucible, the original hardback, the Crucible, is now unavailable to purchase and contained the introduction and background of the Hammers Slammers universe. So I thought this was useful as an addendum to the end of the 3-part series of videos I've created as an introduction into the hobby of the tabletop wargame. A foreword from Dave Drake. In 1969 I was conscripted out of law school, trained as an interrogator, and assigned to the 11th Armoured Cavalry Regiment, the Black Horse. I served with the Black Horse during most of 1970, including the invasion of Cambodia. When I came back to the world in 1971, I began to write fiction. The stories weren't so much about my experiences in Vietnam and Cambodia, but rather about the experience of being a member of an elite armoured regiment in a war which didn't make a damned bit of sense, but where you did your job anyway, because you were a Black Horse trooper. The stories are as real as I could make them. They became Hammers Slammers. I realised as John Treadaway and I talked that I'd never really looked at Hammers vehicles. I don't even have a clear memory of the M48 tank and the ACAVs on which I had ridden daily during my tour of duty. What I remembered was the countryside of Southeast Asia, views over the sight of a machine gun. Thanks to these handbooks, I can now see what I've been writing about for more than 30 years. Introduction. This volume takes David Drake's original works of fiction in the Slammers universe and translates them into a technical guide to the mercenary units, vehicles and uniforms he described. It consolidates the rule systems from previous volumes and handbooks. The authors and designers have collaborated with David at every stage, so the images and information contained here are as authentic as is possible. A time and a place, the human galaxy. The theoretical principles behind faster than light travel were discovered in the late 2nd millennium, but practical experiments demonstrating their utility were not undertaken until the early 3rd millennium. Star probes were successfully launched by the middle of the millennium, and increasingly they actually made it home with live crews who reported the discovery of many Earth-like planets. This period was sometimes known as the Second Age of Exploration, after the mid-2nd millennium on Old Earth. The Second Age of Exploration was followed by the Second Age of Colonization, as interstellar travel became cheaper and more reliable. A new land grab developed amongst the stars. Initially, the richer terrestrial states and corporations planted most of the colonies, usually for economic purposes, commonly to exploit some key mineral or biochemical resource. These were mostly well-financed, but rigidly controlled by the parent body. Poorer nations bankrupted themselves to colonize for reasons of political prestige, the same motivation that led dictators of 2nd millennium, starving nations to build battleships, international airports and 6-lane motorways through the bush. Included in the second poverty-stricken wave were political and religious fanatics who left Earth to build paradise among the stars. Second wave colonization was undercapitalized and the failure rate was enormous. The result was invariable, impoverished, class-ridden, rural socialites clinging to existence by their fingertips. Finally, there was a third colonization wave, funded by the richer, more successful colonies themselves. These enterprises were often multicultural, adding ethnicity to the potential for conflict. It is a commonplace observation that history repeats itself, first as tragedy and then as farce. Many a postgraduate thesis has been hung on the assertion that galactic and terrestrial colonization do or do not resemble each other. If one considers the ancient Spanish and English empires, it is clear that there were two quite separate types of colonies. The first was where a rich but militarily and organizationally weaker civilization state was conquered and looted, as in Mexico or India. No convenient alien race has yet been discovered to fill this role. The second form of colonization was the occupation and expansion into an empty land, as largely happened with the English expansion into North America and Australia. Such colonies have always been a financially losing proposition. They absorbed massive resources from the host nation and promptly rebel as soon as they become economically profitable. A sole imperial power might must with great effort have hung on to its colonies, but in human space there were always rivals for power, and so the scene was set for conflict, and the galaxy burned the mercenary regiments. It is a truism that human beings have never needed much in the way of technology to kill each other, but it is equally true that it never hurts to have better weapons than one's potential opponents provided, and here is the rub: no one knows how to use them. Many of the bush wars that burnt across the galaxy occurred in impoverished, disorganized, politically corrupt, class-structured colonies where armies existed, the troops were undertrained, badly armed and demotivated. The officer class tended to be, if anything, even worse, as commissions and promotions were generally dependent on political or family connections. Few colonies possessed the resources to manufacture anything but the most basic military equipment. Of course, better equipment could be purchased, often at some economic breaking percentage of a colony's GNP, but it was then handed to troops who had little idea how to service the equipment, let alone use it in combat. Peasant communities were littered with immobile and inoperable, prestigious military toys. There were a number of examples of low-tech armies slaughtering nominally better equipped forces. A machete that cuts has many advantages over a laser rifle that fails to fire because the owner did not know to keep the mirrors clean. The classic example was on Sargon's world, where the Bushmen massacred the beautifully tailored and equipped army of the Third Prophet before sacking his city. Grass still grows in the streets of what was Templetown. A better solution was to hire professional soldiers who brought and operated their own equipment. A peasant community could, by putting itself into debt that the grandchild would still be paying, hire an elite regiment for a matter of weeks or months, but at least this way they would have grandchildren. Losing meant impoverishment, cultural annihilation, economic slavery, or even genocide. Mercenaries can be defined as military units that come complete with their own officers and equipment, and can be hired for a limited period of time. This rules out situations where foreigners are co-opted, either voluntary or forcibly, into a national army, and armed and officered by national citizens. Other than that, it is rather difficult to generalize about the mercenary regiments. Some are regular military units of a Terran or colony state hired out for political or financial gain. Others, although recruited primarily from a single state, especially the officer cadre, were organisationally and financially independent of that state's government. At the other extreme were cosmopolitan units that had no connection with any particular state or world. The relationship between mercenaries and their employers is always fraught. The hosts tend to regard their employers as a bunch of unprincipled armed thugs who are leeching off them in their moment of greatest need, and whose loyalty is suspect. After all, business is business, and someone, possibly the enemy, might come up with a better employment offer. It has not been unknown in history for mercenaries to change sides at a critical moment. For their part, the mercenaries tend to treat their employers with open contempt. After all, if they had any balls, they wouldn't need to hire troops. This attitude is not helped by the fact that the only locals most of the troops are likely to meet are the hustlers and the whores who hang around the army camps. However, the real problems arise when the fighting ends. It occurs to the civilians that the mercenaries are now the strongest power in the land, and it occurs to the mercenaries that the civilians might think their pay now an unnecessary expense. The situation can be even worse if the mercenaries side loses. Any armistice deal is unlikely to include clemency to foreign mercenaries, let alone payback. In the late 3rd millennium, mercenary warfare was to be so prevalent that it was commercially viable to set up a bonding authority of merchant banks to oversee mercenary contracts. The authority grew out of Fairchild and Son in Bremen, first merchants' bank to see the lucrative opportunities of war as a business. The system worked by clients depositing a bond of money at the authority, which was released to the mercenaries provided they satisfied their contract, which was to fight, not necessarily to win. Or if the client broke their end of the deal, the authority itself prepared and enforced the contracts. Mercenary units that renegaded were declared outlaw and hunted down and destroyed. In the short term, the authorities civilized the endless bushfires across the galaxy, sharply reducing the incidence of atrocities either by or to the mercenaries. In the long term, by making war just another form of acceptable business, albeit a highly profitable one, the authority had a devastating effect on galactic development. The whole commercial system was breaking down as resources were diverted from infrastructure development into weapons and soldiers. In many ways, this was more devastating than the wars themselves, as planet after planet spent the bulk of its GNP on servicing military debts. The Great Crash was entirely predictable. The men behind the guns, the poverty-stricken agricultural societies scattered across human space, made fertile recruiting grounds for the mercenary regiments. Regardless of losses, they tended to leave every planet they fought upon with as many troopers as they had brought. Regiments generally preferred farm boys as recruits to the urban slum dwellers of old Earth, or the more urbanized colonies because they had fewer psychological problems. Oddly enough, sociopaths, psychopaths and gangsters tend to make bad soldiers. Farming families in the agricultural colonies tended to be large despite the high infant mortality rate. Children were needed to work the farm, however eventually only one offspring and spouse could inherit, or the farm would have to be split into uneconomically small units. The options for younger sons were limited. A trooper's monthly pay in one of the elite regiments was higher than a year's salary of an agricultural labourer. Troopers also got access to medical care and pensions if they survived. The death rate among the dirt poor farmers did not compare particularly favourable with soldiers. Finally, soldiering had a certain romantic wickedness to it. The image of a swooning exotic girl on every planet just ready to be bowled over by a likely lad in a uniform with money to spend held a considerable attraction, at least for the male recruits. If a recruit was lucky, they ended in an elite mechanized regiment where they fought protected by the thickest iridium armor, the best electronics and the most powerful guns the galaxy had ever seen. They also received an education, maybe for the first time in their lives. If they were unlucky, they spent their days as paramilitary policemen in ill-fitting uniforms that sometimes still bore bloodstains from the previous owner, gunning down rioters in shanty towns. Officers in the regiments came from a variety of backgrounds. If the unit was mono-ethnic, the officers might be drawn from the traditional upper classes. Sometimes they were businessmen protecting their investment. In the best regiments, where results counted more than fashionable accents, officers were promoted from below. As long as business was good, and there was never enough productive farmland to go round, the recruits came, whatever their reception. Combat is, however, an expensive business. By the year 319 of the Way, during the campaign of Melponi, when Colonel Hammer had become the commander of the New Friesland Auxiliary Regiment, winning any war had planet-crippling economic ramifications. For Arles Hammer, the Pelamy campaign turned out to be more costly than he was prepared to pay, the cost being the lives of his soldiers. Rather than allow his troops to be sacrificed, he formed the Slammers, a mercenary regiment. Over the following 3 decades, Hammer's Slammers were about the best. There was, despite stiff competition, the Slammers bought the best kit they could and replaced and updated it when finances allowed. They needed to. The other mercs were doing the same thing. In 348 TW, Colonel Hammer became president of New Friesland, and the Slammers were absorbed into the New Friesland Defence Force, NFDF. The Slammers were officially, at least, off the market. Weapons of the late 3rd millennium. The most effective weapons of the late 3rd millennium were power guns. They worked on the principle that metallic atoms of a fixed linear magnetic orientation could be converted directly into energy by the application of heat, pressure, and intersecting magnetic fields. Power guns used cartridges of copper cobalt aligned in a wafer of microporous polyurethane. Power guns released a flash of energy and plasma that stuck in straight lines at light speed. Short iridium barrels were used to protect the firer from scatter. The barrels were cooled with liquid nitrogen but even so, had limited lifespans. Power guns came in all sizes, from 1 to 2 cm infantry weapons to 15 to 25 cm heavy tank guns. Starships and planetary defense systems used similar weapons of up to 100 cm diameter. Quick-firing guns of 1 to 3 cm could be manufactured into multi-barreled Gatlings or Calupis for anti-personnel and air defense uses. One tactical quirk is that power gun shots released all their energy on the first thing they hit. Even soft cover could be protective to a target, at least for the first shot. Power guns were expensive and difficult to manufacture, but were the standard Terran military weapon. High-intensity lasers were utilised in much the same way. They had less destructive power than power guns, were expensive to manufacture, and were more delicate. But they had one major advantage for colonial warfare in they did not require ammunition. Kinetic energy weapons of various sizes, from infantry weapons to heavy tank guns, and various levels of sophistication were still employed. There were too many variants to discuss here, but they break down into simple, cheap, solid, propellant ammunition. The more effective wire-fired liquid propellant rounds and complex electromagnetic railguns or coil guns that fired penetrators at flat hypervelocities. The most sophisticated version of the latter fired osmium flechettes down squeezed cone bore barrels made from a single synthetic diamond crystal. These hypervelocity guns had higher penetration than power guns, but less destructive impact. They were not cheap and could only be manufactured by technologically advanced cultures such as the Gorgon cluster. Artillery weapons included guns, rockets and missiles. Could fire a wide variety of ordnance over considerable distances. Payloads included anti-personnel cluster rounds, firecrackers, anti-armor rounds with seeker heads, ground penetrators, bunker busters, biochemical warfare rounds, nuclear warheads, if anyone was foolish enough not to be protected by nuclear suppressor fields, electronic warfare rounds, reconnaissance rounds, and even good old high explosive and shrapnel. Artillery was truly devastating if it penetrated the opposition's air defense. Artillery was such a potentially puissant weapon that competent armies carried air defense guns that could shoot artillery shells out of the air before they deployed their bomblets. A variety of small to medium-sized multi-barrel Gatlings or Calupis were used in conjunction with sophisticated automatic detectors and targeting devices. Some remarkably simple weapons were in common use, even in the most sophisticated forces. For example, grenades, grenade launchers and buzz bombs. Buzz bombs were simple, unguided, short-range anti-armor rockets with a wide variety of designs. They were an infantryman's personal artillery and could penetrate almost any armor. They gave tankers sleepless nights as they could not be decoyed or shot down, and armoured vehicles' only hope was to prevent the infantry getting close enough or to use automatic strip mines. These were explosive devices positioned along the sides of armoured vehicles. They sprayed shotgun-like blasts of shrapnel. They could be set to fire automatically if the vehicle sensors detected infantry or incoming buzz bombs. Hypervelocity unguided rocket penetrators were used in the anti-tank role precisely because they were too difficult to intercept either by gunfire or strip mines, but these weapons required stable launch bases of greater mass than an infantryman's shoulder. We'll leave links below for more resources and the books to dive into the setting for Hammers Slammers in even more detail. If you would like me to record more videos for tabletop wargaming systems and their backgrounds, then please subscribe and leave comments on what you would like to see or hear.